He gave her his coat. The next day, 700 warriors showed up. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The relentless, shimmering heat of the desert sun beat down on the parched, cracked earth, blurring the horizon into a wavering, mirage-like line. The air was thick with the scent of dust, of sagebrush, of a profound, almost spiritual loneliness. In the heart of this vast, empty landscape, a solitary, sun-bleached farmhouse stood as a testament to forgotten dreams and a bygone era of rugged, uncompromising individualism. This was the world of Thomas Hayes, a 10-year-old boy whose quiet, observant nature seemed more attuned to the subtle rhythms of the desert than to the boisterous, often cruel, world of his peers. Thomas was a solitary child, his days spent not in the company of other children, but in exploring the hidden canyons, the sun-drenched mesas, the silent, ancient landscapes that surrounded his family's struggling farm. He moved through this world with a quiet reverence, his gaze often fixed on the high, lonely cry of a hawk, the intricate patterns of a snake's track in the dust, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts of light and shadow on the distant, purple mountains. His father, a stoic, hard-bitten rancher named Marcus, regarded his son's quiet, dreamy nature with a mixture of gruff affection and a profound, unspoken anxiety. This was a hard land, a land that demanded strength, resilience, a certain brutal pragmatism. Thomas, with his gentle heart and his quiet, almost mystical connection to the natural world, seemed ill-equipped for the harsh realities of their existence. The Hayes family, like so many others in this forgotten corner of the country, was struggling. A prolonged drought had decimated their crops, their livestock was thin, their debts mounting. The air in their small, weathered farmhouse was often thick with a quiet, unspoken tension, a sense of a way of life slowly, inexorably slipping away. On the other side of the ridge, a world away, yet intimately, almost spiritually connected, lay the reservation. It was a place of profound, almost heartbreaking beauty and of equally profound and equally heartbreaking poverty. The people who lived there, the proud, resilient descendants of the ancient tribes who had roamed these lands for centuries, faced their own, unique and often far more devastating struggles. A quiet, almost invisible wall of mistrust, of prejudice, of a long, painful history of broken promises and stolen land separated the world of the white ranchers from the world of the reservation. Encounters were rare, and when they did occur, they were often fraught with a quiet, simmering tension, a sense of two worlds colliding, of two peoples speaking a different language, of a chasm of misunderstanding that seemed too wide, too deep to ever be bridged. Thomas, however, in his solitary wanderings, often found himself drawn to the edge of the reservation lands. He would sit for hours on a high mesa, his gaze fixed on the distant, scattered hogans, on the smoke curling from their chimneys, on the small, brightly colored figures of children playing in the dust. He felt not fear, not prejudice, but a deep, almost instinctual curiosity, a sense of shared humanity, a shared connection to this harsh, beautiful, and ultimately sacred land. He saw not them, but people who, like his own family, were struggling to survive, to endure, to find a small measure of grace in a world that so often seemed to have forgotten them. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the sun began its slow, majestic descent towards the horizon, painting the vast, empty sky in hues of fire and gold, Thomas, on one of his solitary explorations, ventured a little further than usual. He followed a dry, winding creek bed, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the rocks, the subtle shifts in the desert light. And then he saw her. She was a small girl, no older than himself, with a cascade of long, dark hair, her skin the color of rich, dark earth, her eyes, when she looked up at him, as deep, as dark as the desert night sky. She was sitting by a small, gnarled juniper tree, her small frame wrapped in a thin, worn blanket, her body trembling with a quiet, almost imperceptible shudder. She looked lost and profoundly, devastatingly Illinois. Her face was pale beneath her dark skin, her breathing shallow, her eyes holding a mixture of fear, of pain, and of a quiet, almost heartbreaking dignity. She was clearly from the reservation, and she was clearly in trouble. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his father's gruff warnings about the dangers of the reservation, about the unpredictability of its people, echoing in his mind. But then he looked at the girl, at her small, trembling form, at the raw, undisguised suffering in her dark, beautiful eyes, and he felt not fear, but a profound, almost overwhelming wave of empathy, of a simple, unadorned human compassion. The unspoken rules, the invisible walls, the centuries of mistrust and misunderstanding that separated their two worlds, in that moment, simply dissolved. He saw not a stranger, not an other, but a child who was cold, a child who was sick, a child who needed help. And Thomas Hayes, the quiet, solitary boy with a gentle heart, knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very core of his being, that he could not, would not, simply walk away. His day, and indeed his life, was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated, a turn that would challenge not just his courage, but his very understanding of family, of community, of the profound, often unseen, and deeply human connections that bind us all. The girl's dark eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and a feverish, almost otherworldly luminescence, fixed on Thomas as he approached. He moved slowly, cautiously, his hands held open in a gesture of peace, of non-aggression, a silent language he had learned from observing the wary, graceful movements of the desert creatures he so admired. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, his voice a little shakier than he would have liked, the words sounding unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the desert evening. The girl didn't answer. She simply continued to stare at him, her small body trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She clutched the thin, worn blanket tighter around her shoulders, a futile gesture against the encroaching chill of the desert night. Thomas could see the goosebumps on her arms, the bluish tinge to her lips. She was cold, dangerously cold, and profoundly, alarmingly Illinois. He knew he should go for help, run back to his family's farm, get his father. But that would take time, precious time he sensed she didn't have. He looked at her small, fragile form, at the raw, undisguised suffering in her eyes, and he felt a surge of empathy so potent it almost buckled his knees. He thought of his own occasional childhood illnesses, of his mother's gentle, comforting hands, of the warm, thick quilt she would wrap around him, of the hot, sweet broth she would spoon into his mouth. This girl, she had none of that. She was alone. She was cold, and she was fighting a battle. He sensed that she was on the verge of losing. Without a second thought, without conscious decision, driven by a simple, profound, and utterly human impulse of compassion, Thomas shrugged off his own jacket. It was a sturdy, canvas jacket, lined with warm, sheepskin-like fleece, his most prized possession, a recent and much-needed birthday gift from his parents. It was his shield against the harsh, often brutal, realities of the desert climate, a tangible symbol of his family's love, of their meager but hard-won security. He held it out to her, a silent offering. The girl stared at the jacket, then at him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, of suspicion, of a dawning, almost incredulous, wonder. He, a white boy, a stranger from the other side of the ridge, was offering her his coat. It was an act of kindness so unexpected, so utterly at odds with the long, painful history of mistrust and broken promises that had defined the relationship between their two peoples, that she didn't seem to know how to react. Thomas took a step closer, his movements slow, gentle. He draped the jacket around her small, trembling shoulders. It was far too big for her, its sleeves engulfing her small arms, its hem falling to her knees. But it was warm. He could see the immediate, almost miraculous effect of its warmth as the violent shudders that had racked her small body began to subside, replaced by a deep, almost convulsive trembling the kind of trembling that comes not from cold, but from a profound, overwhelming, emotional release. Tears welled in her dark eyes, tracing clean, silent paths down her dusty cheeks. She looked at him, a silent, eloquent message of gratitude, of a dawning, fragile trust, passing between them, a message that transcended language, that defied history, that spoke directly to the shared, universal, and deeply human heart. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a mere breath, weak, raspy, but unmistakably, profoundly sincere. Thomas simply nodded, his own throat tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He knew he had to do more. He couldn't just leave her here. He had to get her home, to her family, to safety. Where do you live?" he asked gently. She pointed a small, weak gesture towards the distant, scattered lights of the reservation, a world away. Yet now, in this moment of shared, profound humanity, suddenly, inexplicably close. He helped her to her feet, her small body surprisingly light, her feverish heat radiating even through the thick canvas of his jacket. He put his arm around her, supporting her, and they began the slow, arduous journey back towards the reservation. Two small, solitary figures moving through the gathering gloom of the desert night, united by a simple, profound, and utterly life-altering act of kindness. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He didn't know the profound and potentially dangerous consequences of his actions. He only knew that he had seen a fellow human being in need, and he had, without hesitation, without question, offered his coat, his warmth, his heart. And in that simple, selfless act, he had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would not just change his own life, but would resonate through his family, through his community, through the very fabric of the two disparate and often hostile worlds that coexisted so uneasily on this harsh, beautiful, and ultimately sacred land. The quiet boy with the gentle heart had just performed an act of profound and entirely unconscious diplomacy. And the ripples of that act were about to spread far, far wider than he could ever have imagined. The journey to the reservation was a slow, arduous trek through the deepening twilight. The girl, whose name Thomas still did not know, leaned heavily on him, her breathing shallow, her small frame racked by occasional, violent fits of coughing. Thomas, his own small body straining under her weight, his arms aching, his feet stumbling on the loose, rocky ground, never faltered. He spoke to her in a low, gentle, reassuring voice, telling her stories of the desert creatures he knew so well, of the clever coyote, of the patient tortoise, of the soaring hawk, his words a quiet, comforting murmur against the vast, indifferent silence of the desert night. As they drew closer to the scattered lights of the reservation, a new, more immediate, fear began to creep into Thomas's heart. He was a white boy, entering a world that was not his own, a world that had every reason to be suspicious, to be hostile, to see him not as a friend, but as an intruder, a representative of a long, painful history of betrayal and oppression. What would they think, seeing him with one of their own, a sick, vulnerable child, wrapped in his oversized, unfamiliar jacket? Would they see his act of kindness for what it was? Or would they see something else? Something more sinister? His fears were not unfounded. As they approached the first, dimly lit hogan, a pack of reservation dogs, their bodies lean, their eyes wary, erupted in a cacophony of furious barking, their voices echoing through the still, cool night air. A figure emerged from the hogan, a tall, imposing man, his face a mask of stern, weathered lines, his eyes, when they fell on Thomas, narrowing with a mixture of suspicion and a dawning, almost feral, protectiveness. He was followed, a moment later, by a woman, her own face etched with a deep, almost palpable anxiety. Thomas's heart pounded. He stopped, holding the sick girl tighter, his own small body a fragile, inadequate shield against the man's intimidating presence. "What is this?" the man demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl, his English thick with the accent of his native tongue. "What are you doing with my daughter, white boy?" His daughter. Of course. Thomas felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a fresh surge of anxiety. He had found her family. But what would they do? Sir, Thomas began, his voice trembling slightly, but his gaze steady. I found her. In the desert. She was very sick. Very cold. I was just trying to bring her home. The man stared at him, his eyes, like chips of obsidian, searching Thomas's face, probing for a truth, for a deception, that lay beneath the surface of his words. He looked at his daughter, at her pale, feverish face, at the oversized, unfamiliar jacket that engulfed her small frame. He looked at the jacket, then back at Thomas, a flicker of something, confusion, surprise, in his stern, unreadable gaze. The woman, her face a mask of anguish, rushed forward, her arms reaching for her child. Althea, she whispered, her voice a raw, heartbroken cry as she gathered her daughter into her arms. My Althea. She looked at Thomas, her own eyes, so like her daughter's, now filled with a mixture of fear, of gratitude, of a profound, almost overwhelming confusion. The man, Althea's father, whose name Thomas would later learn was Black Eagle, continued to stare at him, his silence a heavy, intimidating weight. He was the chief, the leader of his small, tight-knit community, a man whose word was law, a man whose primary and most sacred duty was the protection of his people, of his family. He had seen a lifetime of broken promises, of casual cruelty, of a profound, systemic disrespect from the white world that lay just beyond the borders of his ancestral lands. He had no reason to trust this small, pale boy who had appeared out of the darkness, his daughter wrapped in his coat. Yet there was something in the boy's eyes, a quiet sincerity, an undeniable, almost unnerving empathy, an absence of the arrogance, the condescension, the casual, unthinking prejudice that he had come to expect from the white world. He saw not a threat, but a child who had, for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend, performed an act of simple, unadorned, human kindness. Black Eagle looked at his daughter, at her small, fragile form, now wrapped in the warmth of the boy's jacket, her violent shudders beginning to subside. He looked at the boy, at his own thin, inadequate shirt, his arms now covered in goosebumps from the cold night air. And in that moment, the chief, the warrior, the grieving, terrified father saw not a white boy, not an intruder, but a fellow human being, a small, brave, and undeniably good heart. He said nothing. He simply reached out a hand, his own calloused, powerful hand, and gently, almost reverently, touched the sleeve of the jacket his daughter now wore. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of a dawning, reluctant respect, a silent, unspoken thank you that transcended the chasm of language, of culture, of history that had for so long separated their two worlds. He then turned, his daughter still cradled in his wife's arms, and gestured for Thomas to follow them into the warm, fire-lit interior of their hogan. The pack of dogs, sensing the shift in their master's demeanor, fell silent, their tails giving a few tentative, uncertain wags. Thomas hesitated for a moment. Then, with a mixture of trepidation and a profound, almost overwhelming sense of relief, he followed them inside, into a world he had only ever observed from a distance, a world that was about to embrace him, to honor him, to change him, in ways he could never have imagined. The quiet boy with the gentle heart had crossed a bridge built not of wood or stone, but of a single, simple, and utterly transformative act of human compassion. And the ripples of that crossing were just beginning to be felt. The interior of the hogan was a world away from the harsh, unforgiving beauty of the desert night. A fire crackled in a small, central hearth, its warm, dancing light casting a gentle, golden glow on the circular, earth-walled room. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, of fragrant herbs, of a profound, almost spiritual sense of peace. Althea was gently laid on a bed of soft, sheepskin rugs near the fire, her mother, a woman named Mourning Dove, now murmuring to her in their native tongue, her hands, gentle and sure, preparing a steaming, aromatic broth from a small pot that hung over the flames. Black Eagle, the chief, turned his attention to Thomas. He gestured for the boy to sit, his expression still stern, but the earlier hostility, the suspicion, had been replaced by a quiet, watchful, and deeply thoughtful curiosity. He studied Thomas, his dark, intelligent eyes taking in the boy's thin shirt, his scuffed boots, the quiet, unwavering sincerity in his gaze. He saw not a threat, but a puzzle, an anomaly, a boy who had defied all his preconceived notions, all his long, painful experience of the white world. "You are from the Hayes Ranch, are you not?" Black Eagle asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir. My father is Marcus Hayes." Black Eagle's eyebrow arched slightly. He knew of Marcus Hayes, a hard man, a proud man, a man who, like so many of his kind, kept to his own, who viewed the reservation and its people with a mixture of suspicion and a quiet, almost unconscious contempt. It was hard to reconcile the image of the father with the reality of the son who now sat before him, a boy who had, without hesitation, without question, offered his own coat, his own warmth, to a sick and potentially dying Indian girl. "Your father, he knows you are here?" Black Eagle pressed, his voice still carefully neutral. Thomas shook his head. "No, sir. I was just exploring, as I often do." Black Eagle was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire, his mind clearly wrestling with the profound, unsettling implications of this small, unexpected encounter. He was a man of deep, traditional wisdom, a man who understood the subtle, often invisible, currents that flowed through the world, the delicate balance of cause and effect, of action and consequence. He knew that this boy's simple, selfless act was more than just an act of kindness. It was a sign, a symbol, a disruption of the old, poisoned patterns of mistrust and animosity that had for so long defined the relationship between their two peoples. He looked at his daughter, her breathing still shallow, her face still pale with fever, but her small body now wrapped in the warmth, the protection, the undeniable, almost spiritual power of the boy's offering. And he knew, with a certainty that resonated in the deepest, most ancient corners of his soul, that this act, this gift, required a response. A profound and equally powerful response. He rose to his feet, his tall, imposing figure seeming to fill the small, fire-lit hogan. He walked to a small, intricately carved wooden chest that sat in a shadowed corner of the room. He opened it, his movements slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. From within, he removed a single, beautiful, and undeniably sacred object, an eagle feather, its white tip dipped in a vibrant, almost luminescent red ochre, its shaft wrapped in soft, supple deerskin and adorned with a single, small, turquoise bead. He walked back to Thomas and stood before him, the feather held reverently in his hands. "In the tradition of my people, young Thomas Hayes," Black Eagle began, his voice a low, resonant chant, an act of great courage, of profound generosity, of a spirit that walks in beauty, must be acknowledged. It must be honored. For such acts, they're the threads that reweave the sacred hoop of life, that mend what has been broken, that restore balance. He held out the eagle feather to Thomas. "This," he said, his voice imbued with a deep, almost mystical authority, "is a symbol of that honor. It is a gift of gratitude, a mark of respect, a sign that you, a boy from the other side of the ridge, a boy with a brave and gentle heart, are now a friend to this family, a friend to our people. You will always be welcome here. You will always be protected." Thomas stared at the feather, at its exquisite, almost otherworldly beauty, his heart pounding, a wave of profound, almost overwhelming emotion washing over him. He had not expected this. He had not sought this. He had simply acted from a place of simple, unadorned, human compassion. And now he was being offered a gift of such profound, almost sacred significance that it took his breath away. He reached out a trembling hand and accepted the feather, its texture surprisingly soft, its energy almost alive in his grasp. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank you." Black Eagle simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He then gestured towards the door. "It is late, young friend," he said. "Your family will be worried. One of my young men will guide you home. He will ensure your safe passage." A young, silent warrior, who had been standing discreetly in the shadows, stepped forward, his own face a mask of quiet, respectful curiosity. He nodded to Thomas, then led him out of the hogan, back into the cool, star-dusted beauty of the desert night. As Thomas walked away, the sacred eagle feather clutched tightly in his hand, a new, unfamiliar and deeply, profoundly hopeful chapter of his young life, and of the long, often troubled story of his two disparate and now perhaps finally healing worlds was just beginning. The journey back to the Hayes Ranch, guided by the silent, sure-footed warrior, was a dreamlike, almost surreal experience for Thomas. The desert night, which had once seemed so vast, so lonely, so empty, now felt alive, humming with a new, almost mystical energy. He clutched the eagle feather, its soft texture a constant, tangible reminder of the extraordinary, life-altering events of the past few hours. He had crossed a bridge not of wood or stone, but of a simple, profound, and utterly human act of compassion. And in doing so, he had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would have repercussions far beyond his own small, solitary world. He arrived home to a scene of frantic, escalating panic. His father, Marcus, his face a mask of grim, almost terrifying anxiety, was about to set out with a search party of neighboring ranchers, their horses saddled, their lanterns lit, their faces etched with a shared, communal concern. The sight of Thomas, safe, unharmed, accompanied by a silent, imposing Indian warrior, sent a fresh wave of shock, of confusion, of a dawning, almost incredulous, disbelief through the assembled group. "Thomas!" Marcus Hayes roared, his voice a mixture of profound relief and a simmering, almost explosive, anger. "Where in God's name have you been, boy?" "We were about to, we thought." He trailed off, his gaze falling on the warrior, then on the eagle feather clutched in his son's hand, his expression hardening, a flicker of old, familiar prejudice, of ingrained suspicion in his weary eyes. "And who is this?" he demanded, his hand moving almost instinctively towards the rifle that lay holstered on his saddle. The warrior simply met his gaze, his expression calm, impassive, a silent, powerful challenge to the rancher's presumptive authority. Thomas, seeing the escalating tension, stepped forward, his small body a fragile, inadequate, yet surprisingly effective shield between the two men. "It's okay, Papa," he said, his voice quiet but firm, imbued with a new, almost adult authority. He's a friend. He brought me home." He then, in a clear, unwavering voice, recounted the events of the evening. He spoke of finding the sick girl, Althea, of her fever, her cold, her profound, desperate need. He spoke of giving her his coat, of helping her back to her home on the reservation, of meeting her father, the chief, Black Eagle. He spoke of their kindness, of their gratitude, of the sacred, profound, and deeply humbling honor of the eagle feather he now held in his hand. The ranchers listened, their expressions a mixture of astonishment, of disbelief, of a dawning, reluctant respect. They were hard men, men of the land, men who understood hardship, who understood courage, who understood the brutal, unforgiving realities of life and death in this harsh, beautiful, and often unforgiving land. They looked at Thomas, at his small, determined face, at the eagle feather clutched in his hand, and they saw not just a boy, but a man who had, in a single, selfless act, defied the unspoken rules, the invisible walls, the centuries of mistrust, that had for so long defined their world. Marcus Hayes, his own face a turmoil of conflicting emotions, stared at his son, truly looked at him, for the first time not as a dreamy, impractical child, but as a person of profound, almost unnerving, moral character. He saw not just his son, but a reflection of a better man, a man he himself might have been, before life, before hardship, before the slow, insidious poison of prejudice had hardened his heart, had clouded his vision. The anger, the fear, the suspicion began to recede, replaced by a new, unfamiliar, and deeply humbling emotion, pride. A profound, overwhelming, and utterly life-altering pride in his quiet, gentle, and undeniably courageous son. He looked at the silent, imposing warrior, at his calm, dignified posture, at the quiet, unwavering respect in his eyes. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Hayes saw not an Indian, not an other, but a neighbor, a fellow father, a man who, like himself, would do anything at all to protect his child. He dismounted from his horse, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked towards the warrior, his hand outstretched, not in aggression, but in a gesture of peace, of a dawning, reluctant respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "Thank you for bringing my son home." The warrior simply nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He then turned, and with a silent, graceful movement, disappeared back into the darkness, leaving behind a profound, almost palpable sense of a new and infinitely more hopeful beginning. The search party disbanded, the ranchers returning to their homes, their minds filled with the strange, improbable, and deeply moving story of the rancher's son and the chief's daughter, a story that would, in the days and weeks to come, be whispered in bunkhouses, in feed stores, in the quiet, sun-bleached churches of their small, isolated community, a story that would begin the slow, arduous, and profoundly necessary process of healing. The story of Thomas Hayes's quiet, courageous act of compassion and the profound, unexpected response from the reservation, spread through the small, tight-knit community of ranchers like a gentle, healing rain on a parched, cracked earth. The initial disbelief, the ingrained suspicion, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to give way to a grudging respect, a dawning curiosity, a quiet, almost reluctant admiration for the boy who had dared to cross a line, to defy a prejudice, to see a human being in need, and to simply help. The eagle feather, which Thomas now kept in a small, hand-carved wooden box by his bedside, became a local legend, a symbol of a new, fragile, and deeply hopeful possibility. A possibility of a different kind of relationship between the two disparate and often hostile worlds that coexisted so uneasily on this harsh, beautiful, and ultimately shared land. The change in Marcus Hayes was the most profound. The hard, cynical shell he had built around his heart began to crack, to soften, revealing a man of surprising warmth, of a deep, albeit long-suppressed, compassion. He began to look at his son, not with anxiety, but with a new, profound, and deeply humbling respect. He began to see the world, not as a place of scarcity, of conflict, of a relentless, zero-sum struggle for survival, but as a place of possibility. A place where a single, simple act of kindness could, in fact, change everything. A few days after the incident, a small, hand-carved wooden horse, its lines simple, elegant, beautiful, appeared on the Hayes' front porch, a silent, eloquent gift of gratitude from Black Eagle, a testament to a new, unspoken, and deeply human understanding between the two fathers. Marcus Hayes, in turn, found himself loading up his old pickup truck with sacks of flour, with tins of coffee, with a side of beef from his own meager herd, and driving, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with a new, almost revolutionary sense of neighborly duty, to the edge of the reservation, leaving the supplies as a quiet, respectful offering of his own. These small, silent gestures, these tentative, fragile bridges of connection began to slowly, surely erode the long, high, and seemingly impenetrable wall of mistrust that had for so long separated their two communities. But the true and most profound test of this new, fragile peace was yet to come. Althea, despite the initial expert medical care she had received from her people's traditional healers, remained gravely ill. Her fever raged, her breathing grew more shallow, her small, fragile life hanging by the thinnest of threads. Black Eagle, his heart heavy with a grief that transcended all cultural, all historical divides, knew that his daughter needed more than just traditional medicine, more than just spiritual healing. She needed a doctor, a white doctor, from the world beyond the ridge. It was a decision that went against every instinct, every tradition, every fiber of his being. To entrust the life of his daughter, his precious, beloved Althea, to the very people who had, for centuries, brought only disease, only sorrow, only betrayal to his own. It was a leap of faith so profound, so terrifying, that it almost broke him. But then he thought of the boy, Thomas. He thought of his simple, selfless act of kindness, of the warmth of his jacket, of the quiet, unwavering sincerity in his eyes. He thought of the eagle feather, a symbol not just of honor, but of a new, and perhaps even sacred, trust. And he knew what he had to do. He sent his swiftest, most trusted warrior, the same young man who had guided Thomas home, to the Hayes Ranch, not with a threat, not with a demand, but with a plea, a desperate, humble, and deeply human plea for help. Marcus Hayes received the message with a quiet, solemn gravity. He understood, immediately, the profound significance of this request, the immense, almost unbearable weight of the trust that was being placed in him, in his family, in his world. He did not hesitate. He saddled his two fastest horses, his movements swift, decisive. He told Thomas to stay, to watch over the farm, to be strong. And then he rode, like the wind, to the nearest town, a 2-hour breakneck journey, his heart pounding with a new, almost terrifying sense of purpose, of shared and deeply sacred responsibility. He returned, not with the local, often drunk and deeply prejudiced town doctor, but with a young, brilliant and compassionate army surgeon, a man named Miller, who had been temporarily stationed at a nearby military outpost, a man whose skill, whose integrity, whose fundamental decency Marcus had come to know and to trust. The arrival of Marcus Hayes and the white doctor at the reservation was a moment of profound, almost unbearable tension. The people of Black Eagle's tribe gathered, their faces a mask of suspicion, of fear, of a long, painful, and deeply ingrained mistrust. But Black Eagle stood firm. He met them at the edge of his village, not as adversaries, but as allies. He accepted their help, not as a concession, not as a surrender, but as a gesture of a new and infinitely more powerful kind of strength, the strength of a shared humanity, of a common, desperate, and deeply human love for a dying child. The young army surgeon worked tirelessly, his modern medicine, his scientific knowledge, a strange, yet surprisingly harmonious counterpoint to the traditional healing arts of the tribe's own medicine man. They worked together, two healers from two different worlds, united by a single sacred purpose, to save the life of a little girl. And as they worked, as they shared their knowledge, their wisdom, their hopes, their fears, a new, more profound, and more resonant kind of healing began to take place. A healing not just of a small, sick child, but of a long, wounded, and deeply divided community. The battle for Althea's life was long, arduous, a delicate dance between modern medicine and ancient wisdom, between scientific knowledge and spiritual faith. The young army surgeon, Dr. Miller, worked with a tireless, compassionate dedication. His medical expertise a powerful, life-saving force against the raging fever, the debilitating infection that had ravaged the little girl's body. But he also, to the surprise of many, and to the profound, quiet respect of Black Eagle and his people, listened. He listened to the tribe's medicine man, a wise, ancient elder named Gray Owl, who spoke of the healing properties of desert herbs, of the spiritual power of sacred chants, of the profound, interconnected web of life, of spirit, of the land itself. Dr. Miller, a man of science, a man of logic, found himself humbled, moved, and ultimately transformed by the old medicine man's profound, intuitive wisdom. And Gray Owl, in turn, found the young doctor's scientific knowledge a new, powerful, and deeply effective tool in the ancient, ongoing battle against suffering and death. Together, they formed an unlikely, yet surprisingly effective partnership, their two disparate worlds of knowledge converging, complementing, and ultimately strengthening each other. As Alana slowly, painstakingly began to recover, as the fever receded, as the color returned to her cheeks, as her breathing grew stronger, a new, more profound, and more resonant kind of healing began to ripple through the two communities. The wall of mistrust, of prejudice, of a long, painful history of misunderstanding began to crumble, not through grand political gestures, not through formal negotiated treaties, but through the simple, powerful, and undeniable truth of a shared humanity, of a common, desperate, and ultimately triumphant struggle to save the life of a single precious child. The ranchers, who had once viewed the reservation with suspicion and contempt, now found themselves looking at their Indian neighbors with a new, almost reluctant, respect. They saw not savages, not others, but people. People who loved their children, who feared for their future, who grieved their losses, who celebrated their triumphs with the same fierce and deeply human intensity as they themselves did. And the people of the reservation, who had for so long viewed the white ranchers with a justified and deeply ingrained mistrust, now saw in Marcus Hayes, in his son, Thomas, in the compassionate, dedicated young doctor he had brought to their aid, a flicker of something new, something different, a flicker of genuine respect, of sincere compassion, of a shared and deeply human decency. The change was not swift, not easy. There were still pockets of resistance, of old prejudices, of a bitterness born of centuries of injustice. But a seed had been planted, a seed of hope, of understanding, of a new and infinitely more possible future.